On the edge of a quiet town, wrapped in autumn mist, an old woman sat by a rose garden, staring into years that no longer answered back. No family close, no songs left to sing, just silence and the slow ticking of a clock that seemed to forget her name. Until one morning, a golden puppy appeared out of nowhere, and everything began to change. What was he looking for? Who had he come to find? Stay with us because what unfolds next will warm your heart in ways you didn't expect. This is only the beginning. The air at Silver Pines Assisted Living Facility held the fragrance of lavender soap, fresh laundry, and blooming roses that lined the back courtyard like a memory someone had tried to forget but couldn't. On this crisp morning in late September, the trees of rural Vermont had begun their gentle shift to amber and crimson leaves, spinning slowly to the ground like old secrets being released. Eleanor Mayfield, 82 years old, sat stiffly in a wrought iron chair by the rose garden. Her shoulders were slightly hunched, but not from weakness, rather, from a life spent bracing for news that never came, for footsteps that never returned. Her silver hair was neatly pinned back, and her eyes, pale blue like frozen lakes, rarely blinked when she stared at the horizon. She had lived at Silver Pines for 6 years. Eleanor didn't speak much. She kept her room meticulously tidy and marked her days by tea at 9 a.m., a walk at 3, and a single square of dark chocolate at 8 p.m. Nothing else. Visitors were rare, family distant by both geography and grief. Her son Thomas, a busy banker in Boston, sent flowers on her birthday, but hadn't visited in nearly 3 years. And yet, Eleanor remained dignified, quiet, fading politely. Until the golden pup arrived. No one knew where the dog came from. Early one morning, one of the nurses found him curled up outside the lobby, his soft ears twitching in sleep, fur damp from dew. He was small, perhaps 6 months old, and had that signature honey blonde coat of a golden retriever, but with speckles of dirt and bits of leaves tangled in his tail. No tag, no collar, just a pink tongue and hopeful eyes. "He must have wandered in from the woods," said Marvin, the groundskeeper, scratching his beard. "Poor little fella." The staff decided to keep him temporarily, naming him Sonny, because as one resident put it, he's like a pocket-sized piece of sunshine. Sonny quickly made himself at home, trotting down hallways, dozing under pianos, and sneaking into the communal dining room to beg for meatloaf. But with Eleanor, something unusual happened. It was on the 3rd day of Sonny's stay. Eleanor had just sat down at her usual bench beside the garden when Sonny wandered in his tail, swishing like he'd been waiting for her all along. He approached cautiously, sniffing her shoe. She looked down, her expression unreadable. Sonny sat. Then slowly, carefully, he rested his chin on her knee. Eleanor didn't speak, but she didn't push him away either. Her hand hovered over his head for a full minute before resting lightly on his ear. From that day on, he followed her like a shadow, trailing behind her walker, sitting beside her during bingo, and curling up at the foot of her bed every afternoon as she napped. "He's chosen her," one nurse whispered to another, "and she's letting herself be chosen." Sonny became something of a minor celebrity. The residents loved him. He greeted them each morning, occasionally stole slippers, and listened patiently to stories about long-lost summers and dances under starry skies. But his loyalty to Eleanor was unwavering. One foggy morning, a new ripple stirred. Sonny, in his usual fashion, was busy digging near the edge of the rose garden. Eleanor sat watching him, her knitting needles forgotten in her lap. He scratched furiously, dirt flying until his paw tapped against something solid. Curious, the staff came over, brushed away soil, and uncovered a small wooden box, aged and cracked at the corners. Inside were old letters bound by a faded green ribbon. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she lifted the top one. She recognized the handwriting, immediately looping, hurried, passionate. Her breath caught. It belonged to Robert Langley, her first love. The man she had waited for after he shipped off to Korea. The man who had promised to return, but never did. The letters had been hidden. Why, she didn't know. Had someone else placed them there, or had she done it herself, in the haze of grief and forgotten? As she read the words, her eyes welled. Sonny rested his paw gently on her foot. That evening, Eleanor didn't eat alone. She sat at a table with Frank, a retired teacher, in room 203. Frank had always been fond of crosswords and talking politics, but never of company. That night, however, he said something unusual. "I recognize that handwriting," he murmured, pointing to the open letter. "That's my younger brother's." Eleanor blinked. Frank nodded. "Robert. He never made it home. You were Eleanor Robbins back then, weren't you?" They spoke for hours. Sonny curled up between them, as stories long buried were gently unearthed about young love-lost brothers, and all the wars people wage inside their hearts. The next morning, Eleanor placed a photo of Robert and herself from 1951 beside her bed. Sonny nudged the frame gently before hopping onto his usual spot by her slippers. For the first time in 6 years, Eleanor requested music in her room, a soft instrumental tune that had once been their favorite. Outside, the roses bloomed deeper than ever. The autumn sun rose lazily over silver pines, casting a golden hue across the dew-drenched lawn, as if trying to match the coat of the little dog now firmly rooted in everyone's hearts. Eleanor sat in her usual spot by the rose garden, wrapped in a light shawl with faded lilacs embroidered along its hem. Sonny lay curled at her feet, his nose twitching in rhythm with a dream only dogs could understand. The morning quiet was broken not by chatter or distant traffic, but by a single sound that did not belong there, an abrupt, scratchy crowing. It came from the direction of the tool shed behind the greenhouse. Eleanor's eyebrows raised. Silver pines didn't keep chickens. Curious, she stood with effort, her hands clutching the walker, and shuffled toward the sound, with Sonny immediately alert and trotting ahead. Behind the shed, beside a half-forgotten compost heap and a crooked row of dormant lavender, stood a wire crate. Inside it, feathers rustled, and a proud-looking rooster, black and copper, with a scar down one side of his beak, tilted his head toward them. Sonny gave a soft bark. "Well," Eleanor murmured, "aren't you a misplaced monarch?" She turned to see Marvin the groundskeeper hauling a bag of mulch nearby. "That yours?" she called. Marvin laughed. "Name's Duke. Belonged to a resident who passed a month ago, Mr. Curtis. Used to insist he was training him to crow on cue. Staff kept him around out of respect." Eleanor watched the bird with narrowed eyes. Sounds like he remembers his audience. That day, Eleanor found herself lingering longer than usual outside, not just with Sonny, but with the rooster who seemed oddly drawn to her. When she sat near his crate, he crowed once, then settled. The residents began to notice. First it was Millie, the ex-ballerina who now shuffled in pastel house slippers. Then Harold, a once-feared attorney with soft eyes. They began gathering with Eleanor in the late mornings, sharing memories that crept out like sun-warmed ivy dances from 1942, war rations' first kisses behind soda fountains. The courtyard became a theater of recollection, and Sonny and Duke its mascots. One morning, Frank made his way to Eleanor's bench, carrying something wrapped in oilcloth. "Found this cleaning my closet," he said, placing the bundle on her lap. Inside were folded pages of sheet music, hand-noted in pencil. "Robert wrote music too," he explained. "I think he wanted to ask you to sing it once." Eleanor's voice caught. "He never gave me this." Frank nodded. "We found it after he left. I kept it." His eyes dropped. "I didn't know how to tell you." She looked at him for a long time. The silence that fell was not bitter, just old. Later that day, Eleanor asked the activity coordinator, Jasmine, a bubbly 20-something, with rainbow clips in her hair, if there was a working record player. "You want to play music, Mrs. Mayfield?" Eleanor nodded. "I want to try singing again." And so she did. Not all at once and not in front of everyone. But in her room, in the soft hush of dusk, she hummed along with the melody Robert had scribbled in another life. Sonny lay beside her tail, thumping softly in approval. As for Duke, he crowed each morning now, like clockwork at precisely 9:00 a.m., the time Eleanor once sipped tea alone. The staff, amused but also touched, began to call the trio the Morning Club. Residents looked forward to those early courtyard hours more than anything. Even Thomas, her son in Boston, noticed the change during his next weekly phone call. "You sound brighter," he remarked. Eleanor replied, "I suppose I've been reminded that not everything buried is meant to stay forgotten." She paused. "I'm reading Robert's letters again, and singing." Imagine that. Thomas was silent for a moment before replying, "I'd like to come visit next weekend if that's okay." Eleanor smiled. Yes, that would be nice. On Friday, a letter arrived not in the trembling hand of the elderly, but in elegant ink on handmade paper. It was from a woman named Claire Langley Roberts' niece. She had found Eleanor's name through a local veteran registry that the staff helped her access. The letter thanked Eleanor for being a part of Robert's story and enclosed a small photograph of him in uniform, holding a guitar. Eleanor placed the photo beside her framed picture and whispered, "So many voices lost, but some come back." That night, rain tapped softly against the windows. Eleanor sat with Sonny nestled in her lap, the sheet music resting beside them. She didn't sing, she just listened to the rain, to the old melody in her head, and to the rooster crowing one last time before dark. Something about it sounded less like a wake-up call and more like applause. Frank Delaney had always struck the staff as a man carved out of stubborn stone, his posture rigid, his words brief, and his door mostly closed. He had moved into Silver Pines 5 years ago after a minor stroke left him with a slight limp and a fear of being perceived as weak. In his younger days, he was a high school history teacher, known for his chalk-dusted blazers and the kind of voice that could hush a room without raising itself. Now, at 85, his hair once jet black had turned silver, cut short with military neatness. He still read thick paperbacks and always circled errors in newspapers with red pen as if grading them. But what set Frank apart wasn't just his intellect, it was his isolation. He rarely joined group activities and ate at the far end of the dining hall next to the window facing the woods. Yet, ever since Sonny came along, something had shifted. The dog had a curious habit of visiting Frank's room each morning before joining Eleanor. The first time it happened, Frank tried to shoo him out. "Go on, mutt," he grumbled, waving a slipper. But Sonny had merely sat at the door tail, thumping until Frank gave in with a theatrical sigh. He began leaving his door open. Not much else changed until the morning he overheard Eleanor humming. It came from the garden. Frank sat by his window cup of lukewarm coffee in hand, and through the slight crack heard the old melody, the one Robert used to play. Her voice, though aged and soft, had a clear timbre, and each note seemed to carry more than music, it carried memory. Frank closed his eyes. For decades, he had blamed himself. After Robert's death, he'd found the unsent letter, the unfinished songs, the photograph of Eleanor folded in half. But he hadn't sent anything. He didn't know how to bridge that grief. And now, here she was, singing again, like time had looped back to offer them both a second act. That afternoon, Frank walked into the garden, leaning on his cane, and offered Eleanor a folded piece of sheet music. This was in his journal, he said. "Maybe it's yours now." She looked up surprised and nodded slowly. "Thank you, Frank." Sonny circled their feet, tail wagging like applause. Word of the morning club had spread. Residents began calling it Sunrise Circle instead. Jasmine, the young coordinator, brought out hot cider and cinnamon muffins on Thursdays. The rooster Duke crowed precisely at 9. Eleanor sang softly, and Sonny performed lazy twirls for bits of bread. Harold brought a harmonica. Millie, who had once danced in New York, began teaching slow-seated movements that resembled ballet. The courtyard had become a ritual of joy stitched from scraps of long lives. One day, a new resident moved into Silver Pines, George Harrison, a retired postal worker with a love for puzzles and classical music. George was quiet, polite, but carried a sadness behind his kind smile. Eleanor noticed he kept glancing at the group from a distance, but never joined. So, on a mild Tuesday morning, she walked over to his bench and simply said, "We have cider and sunlight. You bring your company." He smiled hesitant. "Maybe tomorrow." But the next day he came puzzle book in hand and sat beside Frank, who grunted approval. Soon George was part of the rhythm. Meanwhile, Eleanor and Frank began talking more not just about Robert, but about their lives after him. Frank admitted he never married. Came close once, he muttered, "but I always measured every woman against a memory, and none of them stood a chance." Eleanor looked at him with a gentle sadness. "We all hold on to ghosts, Frank. Some just haunt more softly than others." That week, Thomas visited. He arrived awkwardly holding a bouquet of yellow tulips and a bag of sugar-free cookies. Sonny barked once and sniffed him approvingly. Eleanor hugged him not tight, but longer than usual. "Thank you for coming," she said. "You missed the Roosters concert," Thomas chuckled. "You sound different, happier." "Maybe I am," she replied. "Or maybe I'm just remembering how to be." They walked the garden paths together. She told him about Sonny Duke Frank and even the sheet music. Thomas listened. For once he didn't glance at his phone. Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, casting long amber shadows, Eleanor found a small package at her door. Inside was a fountain pen and a blank journal. No note, but she knew who it was from. She opened the first page and wrote, "Some memories are gardens, and some are seeds waiting to bloom again." Sonny nudged her hand as if in agreement. Outside in room 203, Frank sat by his window with an old photo of Robert sipping tea from a mug that read, History is written by those who remember. Silver Pines had never hosted anything grand. Birthdays were celebrated with sheet cakes and plastic flowers, holidays marked with old vinyl records and seasonal wreaths. But on the first Friday of October, under a harvest moon glowing full and gold, something quietly extraordinary took place. It began with a suggestion from Jasmine, the activity coordinator, who saw Eleanor humming softly to herself near the rose garden. What if she said gently, "We planned a little concert, just us, just here." Eleanor looked up. Surprised, her knitting paused mid-stitch. A concert, yes. Jasmine beamed. You could sing, Frank could read one of his poems, Harold plays the harmonica. Millie might even dance a little. We'll hang up lanterns, serve cider. Something small, but something beautiful. Eleanor didn't answer immediately, but when Sunny gently pawed her lap, as if nudging her toward yes, she gave a faint nod. All right, but only if I can choose the moon. Preparations took a week. Jasmine printed simple invitations in but cursive font and slid them under every door. Marvin untangled strings of old fairy lights from the storage closet, cursing cheerfully under his breath. The kitchen prepared cinnamon tarts and apple cider. Even Duke the rooster was bathed and brushed, though unsuccessfully convinced to wear a bow tie. Eleanor spent her days rehearsing the song Robert had written decades ago, the one Frank had kept all these years. She asked Jasmine to help her with breathing exercises. Her voice was softer than it used to be, but it still held clarity, purpose. It had never sounded more real. Thomas called that morning. "You're singing," he asked, half astonished, half proud. "I am," Eleanor replied. "For him. For me. For everyone who forgot we had songs left to sing. He promised to come. And he did." That night the courtyard was transformed. Paper lanterns swayed from the tree branches. The tables were lined with linen cloths borrowed from the chapel, decorated with pressed maple leaves. The air smelled of cinnamon cider and expectation. The residents gathered slowly, Harold with his harmonica tucked into his coat pocket, Millie in a pale pink shawl that fluttered like the memory of Tool Frank, clutching a folder of handwritten notes, and George with a small folding chair and puzzle book, just in case. Jasmine gave a small welcome speech thanking everyone for bringing life into the garden. Then she smiled at Eleanor. "You're up." Eleanor stood beneath the largest oak tree, the moon, a silver coin above her. She held the sheet music in one hand, though she didn't look at it. Sunny sat at her feet, unmoving, as if he too understood the weight of this moment. Eleanor began. Her voice wavered at first, but it found its strength quickly. The melody was simple, built on hope and longing, each word a thread from the past pulled gently into the present. It was a song about waiting, about remembering, about finding light in someone's absence. And as her voice filled the air, the courtyard grew still. The wind paused. The night listened. When she finished, there was no wild applause, only a hush, and then the soft sound of Millie crying, hand over heart. Frank stood and read a poem he had written that very afternoon. It was about ghosts that sit beside us, not to scare, but to remind us we once danced with fire. Harold played a slow blues piece. Millie, to everyone's surprise, rose from her seat and swayed gently in rhythm, her movements ghost-like, but proud. Even George whispered, "I'm glad I came." Later, as residents sipped cider and shared stories under blankets, Thomas sat beside his mother. "You were brave," he said. Eleanor shook her head. "No, I was late. But sometimes the heart arrives when it's finally quiet enough to be heard." She reached down to pet Sunny, and it helps to be followed by pause. The moon stayed overhead long after the music faded. People lingered reluctant to go back inside. Jasmine, eyes glassy with emotion, leaned against Marvin and whispered, "I think tonight was magic." Marvin simply nodded. "It's the dog, always the dog." In the end, Eleanor returned to her room with a slow grace in her step. She placed the sheet music on her dresser beside Robert's photo and the journal Thomas had given her. She looked around the room and saw that it no longer felt like the end of a story, but the middle. That night, Sunny curled up tighter than usual, his head resting against her slippers, as though guarding not just her feet, but the path she'd begun to walk again. The days following the moonlight recital carried with them a warmth that lingered beyond the chill of October. Residents of Silver Pines smiled, more, spoke longer, and walked slower, not from frailty, but to savor the moments between one story and the next. Eleanor now, a fixture in the garden and the common room, had begun journaling again. She wrote in the early mornings while Sunny dozed by the window, the scent of chamomile tea rising beside her. It was during one of these mornings while searching for her misplaced reading glasses that Eleanor wandered into the north wing, a part of the building no longer used. The hallway smelled of old paint and mothballs, the wallpaper faded and peeling, like sun-worn memories. Most of the doors here were locked, their plaques tarnished, their doorknobs cool to the touch. Sunny patted softly beside her nose, twitching tail, low but alert. Halfway down the corridor, Sunny paused. His ears perked. He turned toward a narrow utility closet tucked between two empty rooms and scratched once at the base of the door. Eleanor, curious, turned the knob. It opened with a reluctant creak. Inside was dust and silence and a single wooden box resting on a metal shelf. It was no larger than a bread loaf, carved with ornate swirls and secured by a small brass latch. Eleanor hesitated, then opened it. Inside, old photographs, dried flowers pressed between book pages, a broken music box, and a stack of letters wrapped in a pale pink ribbon. She carried the box back to her room, heart beating faster than it had in years. Sunny trotted proudly, tail held high. That evening, with Frank sitting across from her and Thomas on a weekend visit again, Eleanor laid the contents on her desk. The photos were of a woman in her 20s, with auburn hair and bright eyes, always laughing, always dancing. The back of each photo was marked Marjorie, 1955. The letters were written in looping cursive from a man named Walter. He called her "My Moon in the Dark" and spoke of jazz clubs, stolen kisses, and a plan to run away together. But the last letter, dated December 1955, ended abruptly. "I waited. You never came. They told me you left without a word. I hope you find peace even if it's not with me." Eleanor's voice was soft. "She never left. She died here. I remember the name. Marjorie Ellis. Room 110. Frank rubbed his temple. The Ellis girl. She was a nurse before she was a resident, danced until her legs gave out. I thought she had no family." "She did," Eleanor whispered. "She had Walter." They shared a silence broken only by Sunny's gentle breathing. That night, Eleanor asked Jasmine if they could create a memorial wall, just a small one in the north hallway. Jasmine agreed immediately. "Let's remember her. Properly." The next week, they hung Marjorie's photos beneath soft lighting. Eleanor wrote a small poem to frame beside them. Frank donated one of his old records, a 1950s jazz vinyl, with a cracked label but a melody that still played smooth as silk. They placed the broken music box in a glass case, its little ballerina still poised mid-spin. Residents who had forgotten her name now stood quietly before the display, as if greeting an old friend they never knew they had. One morning, while visiting the memorial, George approached Eleanor. He held a folded paper. "I knew her," he said. "Back before Silver Pines, she was my neighbor. I remember hearing her hum on her porch. She used to say she was waiting for the train to change tracks." He handed Eleanor the note, a poem he'd written. "Maybe you can add this." She nodded, eyes glistening. "We will." Later that day, Eleanor sat with Sunny in her lap, looking out at the wind shaking red leaves from the trees. "How many stories lie hidden here," she murmured. "How many boxes are waiting?" Sunny gave a soft bark, as if to say more than we know. The first rain of winter came, not with thunder, but with a quiet persistence, like fingers tapping gently on a locked door. It soaked the ivy creeping along the outer bricks of Silver Pines, darkened the wooden rails on the front porch, and pattered against Eleanor's window, as if to remind her that even the sky weeps for what's been left unsaid. Eleanor stood beside her window, one hand resting on Sunny's head. The golden pup, now nearly grown, had filled out, but still carried the same gentle warmth in his eyes. His coat had grown thicker for the season, and small flecks of white now dotted the tips of his ears. He was no longer the frightened stray who wandered in with dirt on his paws. He had found his home, and with it, his purpose. A car pulled into the front lot, dark gray, polished and far too modern for the gravel drive. Eleanor didn't move, but Sunny did. He barked once short and low. "I know," she whispered, voice steady. "It's Thomas." Thomas stepped out of the car, in a pressed navy coat. He stood tall, over 6 feet, with the same high cheekbones as Eleanor, and deep-set eyes that flicked quickly between things as if measuring risk. His salt and pepper hair had been combed back, not a strand out of place. He walked with a tension that looked like habit, as though life had trained him never to relax. As he reached the lobby, Jasmine greeted him warmly, but he barely offered a nod in return. "I'm here to speak to my mother," he said, eyes already scanning the halls. "She's expecting you," Jasmine replied, not unkindly. "She's in the library." Thomas found Eleanor seated in an armchair near the old fireplace, a blanket across her knees, a book open but unread. Sonny lay curled at her feet. Thomas hesitated in the doorway, hands buried in his coat pockets. "Mother?" Eleanor looked up. "Thomas." He entered slowly, not quite knowing where to sit. Finally, he perched on the edge of the armchair opposite her. "You've made quite the name for yourself here," he said, forcing a smile. "The singing, the rooster. I even heard there's a hallway named after a ghost." Eleanor didn't laugh, but her eyes softened. "You didn't come all this way for ghost stories." Thomas leaned forward, elbows on knees. "No, I came to bring you home." The silence that followed was not cruel, but deep, like a valley carved by years of missed birthdays and unspoken phone calls. "Thomas," she said quietly, "this is my home." He frowned. "But you're alone here." "I was, not anymore." He looked at Sonny, then at the faded photograph of Robert on the shelf. "You built a life in the shadow of a man who left you." "He didn't leave," Eleanor said gently. "He died." Thomas closed his eyes, jaw tight. "I didn't mean it like that." Eleanor's voice for the first time wavered. "You didn't mean a lot of things, Thomas, but you said them anyway." The rain tapped harder now, almost rhythmically. Sonny rose and rested his head on Thomas's knee. The gesture caught him off guard. "Does he always do that?" Thomas asked. "Only when someone's holding something heavy." They sat for a moment, Thomas staring into the dog's amber eyes, Eleanor watching her son with a quiet grief. A knock at the door broke the tension. It was Marvin, the groundskeeper, holding a small box wrapped in plastic. "Sorry, Ms. Mayfield. Found this in the shed. Thought you might want it." Eleanor thanked him. After Marvin left, she opened the box. Inside was an old notebook, hers. Weather-worn, the ink inside had bled from damp, but her handwriting was still visible. It was a journal she had kept in the early days of Silver Pines, when she felt more ghost than guest. She handed it to Thomas. "Read it, when you're ready." He opened the first page and read aloud. "Day 3. No one knows I used to sing. No one asks. I think that's a blessing." He stopped. His eyes glistened. "I didn't know you were sad. You didn't ask." They both sat in that heavy truth. Then quietly Thomas said, "I was angry after Dad died. You didn't grieve like I did." "I couldn't. I had to survive." The fireplace cracked. Outside, the wind carried the faint scent of pine needles and wet earth. For the first time in years, Thomas removed his coat and stayed a while. The next day he helped Marvin put up storm shutters. He had dinner in the communal hall, sitting beside George and listening to Millie describe her days dancing at Radio City. He even let Duke the rooster hop onto his lap, much to everyone's amusement. He laughed, really laughed. That night, Eleanor wrote in a new journal, "He came not to take me home, but to see I already have one." Sonny curled up beside her, one paw draped over her slipper. The morning after the rain had washed Silver Pines clean, Eleanor found a cream-colored envelope tucked under her door. It bore no stamp, no return address, not even a name. Just her own, written in a familiar looping hand. She stared at it for a long time, fingers trembling slightly, then slipped it into the pocket of her cardigan and made her way to the garden. Sonny walked beside her in silence, his ears slightly pulled back, as if sensing the weight of what she carried. The letter smelled faintly of cedar and age. She waited until she reached the bench by the last of the blooming roses, sat, and slowly opened it. "Eleanor, if this reaches you, it's because I finally found the courage to say what I should have said decades ago. You were the best thing that ever happened to Robert, and perhaps selfishly the best thing that ever happened to me. I knew even back then that he was going to propose to you. He told me in the barracks before he shipped out, holding the ring our father gave him. He was scared not of war, but of losing you before he could speak the words aloud. I promised to deliver something to you if anything happened to him. I failed. I found the ring and his belongings after the notice came. I read the unsent letter he wrote you and kept it. I don't know why I never gave it to you. I think I was afraid of what it would do to you, or maybe I was afraid of losing the little piece of him I had left. I'm sorry. F." Eleanor's breath left her like a tide pulling back from shore. Her eyes didn't fill with tears this time. Instead, there was a quiet stillness in her chest, as if something long unsettled had finally landed. Sonny placed his paw on her shoe unmoving, and she reached down to stroke his head. Later that afternoon, she walked to room 203. Frank was sitting in his recliner, a book of Civil War letters open on his lap. He looked up. "You read it?" She nodded. "Yes." He didn't speak. Neither did she. But when she stepped forward and placed a hand gently on his shoulder, something eased in his face. They sat together as dusk fell, not in grief, but in shared remembrance. In the days that followed, Eleanor visited the old chapel, tucked at the back of the property, an often-forgotten space with stained-glass windows dulled by dust and time. There she met Sister Marie, a volunteer chaplain who visited twice a month. Marie was in her early 60s with tightly curled gray hair and a quiet elegance. She was tall, thin, and wore deep blue robes with sleeves always slightly too long. Her voice was calm and almost musical. Years ago, she had been a classical pianist until arthritis in her hands forced her to leave the stage. She had come to Silver Pines seeking silence, but found stories instead. When Eleanor shared the letter with her, Marie did not speak immediately. Instead, she walked to the old upright piano in the chapel's corner and gently pressed a single key. "Truth," she said, "is like this note. It may be quiet, but once played, it echoes." They decided to hold a small remembrance for Robert. Nothing formal, nothing solemn. Just an evening where music and memory would intertwine. Jasmine helped organize it. George offered to read the final letter. Millie prepared a slow dance set to one of Robert's favorite wartime songs. Even Duke the Rooster seemed to understand the gravity of the moment he didn't crow that evening. As the chapel filled with soft lamplight and the scent of jasmine tea, Eleanor stood beside the piano and finally placed the ring Robert had left behind into a glass keepsake box alongside a copy of the unsent letter. She spoke not to the room, but to the space within her heart that had always waited. "He didn't forget," she said softly, "and now neither will I." Meanwhile, outside the chapel, Sonny waited, paws tucked under, watching the wind rustle the fallen leaves. And across the courtyard, a small cat had begun appearing each day. She was thin with a torn left ear and mottled gray fur. Residents began calling her Dusty for the way she blended into the stone paths. Dusty didn't trust easily. She'd been seen limping near the greenhouse weeks before, but never let anyone near except Sonny. For some reason, she followed him at a distance, curling up in whatever patch of sun he rested in, never quite touching, but never far. On the night of the remembrance, she appeared again sitting at the chapel door. And when Eleanor stepped outside, she paused, then meowed a small, hoarse sound. Eleanor bent slowly and extended a hand. Dusty sniffed it, blinked once, then sat down beside her feet. "I suppose we all carry ghosts," Eleanor said, stroking Dusty's spine. "But it's good to let them rest." The next morning, she awoke to find both Sonny and Dusty curled on the rug at the foot of her bed. She didn't question it. Some things like music and forgiveness simply arrive when they're ready. The frost came gently that November, weaving silver through the corners of windows and painting the rose garden in delicate white lace. At Silver Pines, the heaters hummed softly, old radiators hissing like contented sighs, and the scent of baked apples and cinnamon drifted through the halls. For Eleanor, the cold no longer bit the way it used to. Warmth had come not just from sweaters or tea, but from something far deeper, a life rediscovered. She had made her decision weeks ago after Thomas's last visit. He had offered once again to bring her home to Boston, but this time she smiled and said, "I am home." He understood, and for the first time in years left without guilt in his shoulders. Sonny had changed too. What started as companionship had become service. With Jasmine's help, Eleanor submitted an application to have him recognized as an official therapy dog for the facility. It was approved within 2 weeks. Sonny now wore a small blue vest that read, "Certified Companion, Silver Pines." He seemed proud of it, strutting slightly more as he made his morning rounds, pausing beside wheelchairs, resting his head on trembling knees, always gentle. He had found his purpose. Dusty the stray cat with the torn ear and quiet gaze had stayed. No one claimed her, but no one needed to. Marvin built a small insulated shelter for her behind the garden shed, and every morning she walked the edge of the courtyard wall like royalty. She remained aloof to most, except Sonny and Eleanor. On some afternoons, she could be found curled beside Eleanor's chair in the sunroom, her tail flicking like a metronome while Eleanor read aloud. The reading sessions had started small, just Eleanor and Frank at first going over old letters from a box they called the Forgotten Shelf. But soon others joined. Millie brought postcards from her time abroad. George shared ration notes from World War II. Even Jasmine found a letter from her grandmother, written in Vietnamese, which she translated aloud one afternoon, tears in her eyes. It became a tradition, the memory circle, every Thursday at 3. They sat in a ring, letters in hand, stories flowing like rivers that finally remembered their source. New residents had arrived too. One of them, Sarah Langdon, brought fresh energy to the group. Sarah was a retired librarian, petite and silver-haired, always dressed in soft, earth-toned shawls. Her eyes were sharp, but her smile came slowly, like the rising of a guarded dawn. She had spent much of her life caring for her younger brother, who had passed from a chronic illness 2 years earlier. That loss had hardened her manners. She spoke with precision, moved with purpose, and rarely shared emotion. But on her 3rd week, she attended the memory circle. She brought with her a letter from a soldier she had written to during the Vietnam War, one she never met but corresponded with for 5 years. As she read it aloud, her voice cracked only once, and Sonny, lying near her feet, looked up and placed his paw gently on her shoe. She didn't cry, but after the session she sat beside Eleanor and said, "I haven't read that letter in 40 years. It felt like breathing again. Frank, whose memory had begun to slip in small, merciful ways, sometimes forgot the exact years or names, but not the feelings. During one session he stood and said, "I don't remember the words of the poem I wrote for her, but I remember the way her eyes looked when she sang." Eleanor reached over and squeezed his hand. That's the part worth remembering. Jasmine now, more than a coordinator, more like family, helped digitize the memory circle letters. She started a project called Voices of the Pines, scanning and archiving every document, postcard, and story, with help from her younger brother Leo, a tech student who visited on weekends. Leo was tall and lanky, wore large round glasses, and always smelled faintly of printer ink. He was shy but polite, and had a habit of offering people their own scanned pages, printed and laminated, wrapped in ribbon. "So, it won't fade again," he'd say quietly. The holiday season came with quiet reverence. The chapel was lit with candles for the first snowfall. Frank read aloud from a book of winter poems. Sarah prepared a list of stories to share from past Christmases, including one where she'd accidentally gift-wrapped a live chicken. Laughter became easier. Eleanor continued journaling daily. Her latest entry read, "I thought my days of meaning were behind me, but here I have found them again, not in the grand, but in the shared. A cup of tea, a story retold, a paw on my knee." On the first day of December, the staff hosted a gathering under the lanterns strung through the garden. It was cold, but no one seemed to mind. They called it Golden Day in honor of Sonny's vest and everything he'd come to represent. There were no speeches, just music, memories, and warmth. Eleanor sat in the center, surrounded by those she had come to love. She looked at Sonny beside her, Dusty, watching from a garden bench, Frank chuckling at one of Millie's jokes, Sarah deep in conversation with Jasmine, and Leo snapping photos with his old digital camera. Everything felt whole. She leaned back in her chair, eyes on the stars just beginning to blink awake. "I never thought the end of the road would look like this," she whispered. Sonny lifted his head as if to say, "It isn't the end, just the golden part." Sometimes the miracles we pray for don't come in grand gestures, but in golden fur, quiet footsteps, and the simple presence of something that stays. Eleanor didn't need to be rescued from her old age. She just needed someone or something to remind her that she still mattered. In a world that moves so fast sometimes, the greatest blessing is when time slows down just enough for healing to begin. If you believe in second chances and unexpected visitors sent by grace, and in the quiet work of God's love, then let this story be your reminder. You are never too forgotten to be found. You are never too old to be loved. Leave a comment below if this touched your heart. Write Amen to send a prayer for those who feel alone tonight. Share this story with someone who might need hope today. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay with us. More stories of love loss and little miracles are on the way. May God bless you and all those you hold dear.